Mr. Quinn, welcome to Brussels. It's such an honor and a pleasure that you have made this trip here for a visit to the European Union. But before we talk a bit about your visit, I wanted to ask you if you can tell us a bit more about what it means to be the Special Rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities, which is your function.
Well, first of all, the pleasure is all mine, let me assure you. The mandate is quite special because, as I see it, we're here to assist states, in this instance the European Union, in their journey to implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's a challenging instrument. We all know that the cultural shift that the Convention requires is quite profound, and we get the impression that the European Union is moving generally in the right direction, so we're here to encourage that trend.
Thank you. And when you say this really requires a change in the way we think, what exactly is it that states have to change in order to meet the requirements of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities?
The way I put it is that we have a new myth system in the Convention, a new politics of disability, but we also have a new operation system. And states generally find it challenging to bridge the gap between the two, to make sure that the new myth system comports with the new operation system. So what we're really looking at is how the European Union is doing, both in its external action, in how its internal laws and policies match its ambitions in its external action, and more particularly how it assists its member states move in the right direction, even when the European Union doesn't have very clear legal competence to act. It still has the wherewithal to assist its member states in moving in the right direction. And crucially, unlike, for example, the Organization of American States or the African Union or even the Council of Europe, it has financial instruments at its disposal, and it's really important that these instruments are harnessed properly so that the European Union can close the gap between high-level aspirations and how it actually delivers on the ground for 87 million European citizens with disabilities.
How do we know there are 87 million persons with disabilities? Because many of the countries in Europe do not collect disaggregated data. So how do you reach that number?
Because the European Union says there are 87 million European citizens with disabilities. These statistics are well attested by the European Union itself.
And what are some of the challenges in their daily lives that people face with disabilities on the European continent?
I mean, frankly, to be really independent in your own life, you've got to be economically independent. And so one of the main challenges to us is economic independence. The right to work, the right to access work, the right of accessibility, so that everything is accessible to you like everybody else. And we are, as it were, tracking how that's in fact achieved.
And how is your visit here to the EU been going? You were saying that you are encouraged by some movement, but that you also see room for further progress.
It's quite positive if you look at the overall trend line in terms of external action, in terms of law and public policy that the European Union itself is implementing. But there are some gaps. And one of the gaps is not new. It's been there for years, for at least 10 years, which is how the European Union is harnessing its financial muscle to actually achieve the overall goals of its new disability strategy.
And what do you think in this new disability strategy is really a key element where the European Union could push and could help the member states to realize the rights of the human rights of persons with disabilities?
Well, let's be honest. The key issue is whether segregation on the basis of disability, especially in its more extreme forms, which takes the form of institutionalization, amounts to discrimination. Not everybody concedes the point. Not all of the European funds concede the point, particularly when it comes to the European structural and investment funds, and in particularly when it comes to the recovery and resilience funds. That is the core challenge, remaining challenge as we see it. And it's a pity because there's been such a positive movement in the right direction in terms of the Digital Services Act, in terms of the EU accessibility legislation, warts and all. And of course there are challenges in all of these pieces of legislation, but it seems to us that there is not yet a consensus that this form of segregation amounts to discrimination and should be removed.
Now, for some of our viewers who may not be familiar with the details of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, what is the alternative to institutionalization? What is it that member states should be doing and that the European Union, with its financial muscle, as you say, should be supporting?
All of the dots are there. They just haven't been joined. A lot of the cost-benefit analysis is now in. That shows that the alternatives to institutionalization are more or less cost neutral. The European Fundamental Rights Agency has taken the next logical step to show how our member states can move their budgetary arrangements to enable this to occur. Many states around the world do not institutionalize even people with dementia because they've come to the conclusion that, you might say for some of the wrong reasons, that the institutionalization of people with dementia just is counterproductive, that it generates additional costs, immediate medical costs. That is to say, congregation generates these costs, whereas community living doesn't. And artificial intelligence shows how many of the challenges we have in deinstitutionalization can be overcome, that the personalization of services can be achieved. So all of these dots are there, they just haven't been joined up. And it's curious to us, why not? Because you and I, the European taxpayer, hey, our tax euros are not actually being used for the right reasons. So it really is a curiosity to us why the dots have not been joined, deinstitutionalization has not been achieved, and that the advantages that deinstitutionalizing shows can be achieved haven't been achieved. And everybody knows this is the case. So it remains curious to us why this form of institutionalization is not conceived of as discrimination. And mind you, in the UN system, we all concede that discrimination is something to be immediately avoided,
Yes.
and not to be progressively achieved. Why that's not the case remains a profound curiosity to us in 2022.
Mr. Quinn, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we are seeing that some countries are moving away from very large institutions and they're building smaller institutions, which they then say are community-based care because of their location within the community. What is your reaction to that?
Nonsense. There is no such thing as an institution that's based in the community. It's simply not true. And to move from larger institutions to smaller institutions that happen to be spatially connected in the community, it's not good money of taxpayers' money. It's not community living, as far as I see it. It just isn't the case. And the UN Committee's conception of progressive realization just doesn't match with how we actually achieve things on the ground. And in actual fact, to achieve community living, that's an immediate obligation. It's not someone that's amenable to progressive realization. So there's a fundamental disconnect in how we conceptualize the exact same issue, how to achieve equality for persons with disabilities, in the UN system and in the EU structural funds. There's a profound disconnect between the two.
And as someone who studies and reviews progress by countries around the world when it comes to the rights of persons with disabilities, what for you is the key lesson that we should draw or that we should learn from the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to the rights of persons with disabilities?
We have to have policy imagination. We have to concede that institutionalization has generated a lot of vulnerabilities for groups that bring to the table their own vulnerabilities. And I don't mean that they're inherently vulnerable. What I mean is we generate the vulnerable situations into which they are exposed. So to be institutionalized in COVID has demonstrated amazing vulnerabilities for people with disabilities and older people with disabilities in institutionalized situations. Hey, our Prime Minister in a very small country conceded that what we have been doing for people with disabilities, deinstitutionalizing them, has to also be done for older people, particularly older people with disabilities, into the future. That's exactly the right way to go. And it's fully achievable if we have a new policy imagination and we turn around all of the largesse that we're distributing in this area to ensure community living. That is the key message.
So how does that work in practice? Let's say there's a couple and they're both working and they're also taking care of an older person with a disability. Then what's the solution?
Great question. Because I've been to several countries where people with dementia, they're not institutionalized. There are no categories of people for whom institutionalization is the right way forward. Many countries have, the penny has dropped. In many countries, people have seen that you don't institutionalize people with dementia, because if you do, the cost increases incredibly exponentially. No, we find innovative solutions to make sure that even people with dementia can remain in their own community. So there's no category of person for whom they can't do it. It's just laughable for example, if you go to the United States, that we would institutionalize such persons. So it's quite amazing that although we have the wherewithal, the penny just hasn't dropped in some circumstances, and in some countries, and in some systems of governance.
So a final question to you, Special Rapporteur. Somebody who is looking at this interview and says, I want to do something, I want to defend and stand up for the rights of persons with disabilities. Concretely, what can such a person do?
Think about segregation. Think about equality. And when somebody says to you, there are some people for whom that's a pipe dream, think about it, stand back and reflect, and then react and say, you know, I wouldn't want that in my life. I have cousins, I have friends, I have family for whom I wouldn't want that for them. Think about carers. There are many, many, many carers of older people and people with disabilities who deserve support.
Yes.
Think about how we change the billions of dollars and euros that we put into this, how we turn that around, how we make sure everybody has a chance to flourish as a human being. That's all we're looking for.
Special Rapporteur, when we talk about education, people sometimes say that it is just practically impossible to integrate persons with disabilities into mainstream education, and that this would put too much of a burden on the rights of on the shoulders of the teachers. What's your reaction to that?
You know, I think the key insight in the human rights field is people are not a problem. People are not a problem. They have human rights. And it's de-problematizing people that is our core challenge. Whether it's persons with disabilities or persons with disabilities, older people. So my response is that absolutely teachers need support. Absolutely we need to take the next step to support teachers. But people are not problems. They have human rights.
Indeed. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you so much.